Welcome to Class Time. Watch us in real time on the Television Jamaica's YouTube channel or One Spot Media. We also are live on Music 99 and GoJamaica.com. And if you have questions on any of today's subjects, send them into Television Jamaica's Facebook page at Television Jamaica or Instagram at Television_Jamaica, or use the hashtag TVJ Class Time. Today we start with Cape Caribbean Studies, then we jump over to CSEC Agricultural Science and back to Cape with Biology. I'm Melissa Beckford-Simpson, your Cape Caribbean Studies teacher for today. Let's get started. Okay, so for today's lesson, we are going to be looking at Caribbean society and culture, but more specifically, stratification. So we're going to understand the factors that have contributed to social stratification in the Caribbean. What are our objectives? We want to say what we mean by social stratification. We want to examine the terms associated with social stratification. We want to discuss the theories, yes. We want to determine the extent to which Caribbean society is characterized by the plantation, as we will discuss later. And then, of course, at the very end, we want to learn how to construct proper essays and master multiple choice questions. Let's get right into it. So let us remind ourselves, first of all, what is a society? Now, these are the factors that make up a society. A group of people who have a shared common purpose, who live within a defined territorial space, geographical space. There is continuity over time and space, and there is citizenship within this space. So less than that, we don't have a society. You may have nomadic groups of people who move around, but unless you have all of these elements, we don't actually have a society. So first we have to know what a society is in order to understand how the society is then stratified. All right, so then what is social stratification? It is the division of the society into groups or strata. An alternative definition, a system of inequality where persons are ranked based on predetermined factors, and this may vary from society to society. And we look at this. It implies that at least one group has more of what is valued by that society. And you may ask, why do I say by that society? Because values, we have already looked at values. Values change, or values are different. They are relative to societies. And some of these things include money, power, and prestige. And we're going to locate social stratification within the Caribbean, which is why we use these examples. But for other societies, other things could be very much more valuable than these things. All right? Now, stratification is as old as society itself. So, for as long as we can recall any kind of society, there has been stratification. And when we look at these ancient and medieval societies, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, and feudalist Europe, then we understand. And usually, when we talk about stratified society, we are using a pyramid to demonstrate. No, never mind my pyramid. But we are using a pyramid to demonstrate, right? And so there's usually a large group at the bottom somewhere here, most times, because it represents the majority of the society. And then there's usually a very tiny group at the top, the elite. So when you look at any of these societies, and perhaps you would have done some of them already in, second form or so, where you looked at ancient Egypt, for example, or ancient Mesopotamia, there was always some kind of structuring. There's always the idea that there are different groupings in a society based on whatever it is that the society values, and that these different groupings are, more or less important or less important according to how you look at it. But there's always this huge base for the pyramid right at the bottom where the majority of the people are. And we're going to find out why this is so. Now, we have two different types of systems of stratification. The first is an open system. And I choose to look at the open system first, because there are a number of things that we can jump off when we're talking about Caribbean stratification as it relates to the other system, which is, of course, a closed system. So we talk about an open system. We're saying that persons from different strata have an opportunity to move up or move across, depending on how you're looking at it. So persons can actually move up or down or across based on a predetermined set of factors of that society. All right? Usually this system is not structured, based on race or religion, because those are things you don't generally change, especially when you're talking about race. You can't change your race. If you're black, you're black. You can't change that. And so we're not necessarily talking about systems based on race or religion, because those things tend to divide people very much. And then in the Caribbean society, though, education may be the most important determining factor, although there are other factors too. All right? We're going to examine some of these factors. And this system is usually considered a class system. Please note the terminology that we're using as it relates to stratification, because in your writing, you will have to reproduce these same kinds of terminology. All right? So let's look at this open stratification system. One bright spark somewhere in your living room should be able to tell me which system this is representing. Because we have, in fact, looked at the different groupings of people in the Caribbean before. So you must be able to tell me, man. We have at the top the Ubuntu. Think about it. All right. Now, we are, in fact, referring to the Kalinago social structure. Yes, the indigenous peoples also had a social structure, albeit not quite the same as ours today, but they did. All right? Now, their system was very communal in terms of how they operated, right? And then when you're looking at the Taina too, even more so. But most importantly, we want to look at these terms. It was a meritocratic system, and status was achieved. We know what the word achieved means, right? It means you have to work for it. Same thing for meritocratic. You don't just get something. You have to earn it. You have to work for it. Let's look at an example. The Kalinago system of choosing a leader. Very good example of how meritocracy comes in. And when you talk about an assy or a crassy, you're talking about a system, usually a kind of political system or social system. So, for the Kalinago society, it's very interesting what they do. So, first thing you need to know is that at the very beginning, once the boys are born, they are weaned as quickly as they can from their mothers. And then they're taken away, because boys must not grow with women, because women were too soft, you know. They could not give them the kind of prowess and bravery that they needed to be taught. So they had to be taken away from the mothers, and then they would go live with the men. And the men and the women lived differently, separately. So from the child is weaned, this boy, he begins to be trained like a warrior. He has to learn to think like a warrior. You remember the text, the young warriors? Even though that refers to the Maroons, it's a similar kind of ideology or idea. They are taken away and then they are trained how to be tough, how to be brave and strong and courageous. And then now, when he becomes of age, then he has to pass certain tests in order to become a warrior. Because in the Kalinago society, you see, being a warrior was everything. That was what it was all about, you know? And so he had to now pass certain tests in order to become a warrior. What did he have to do? A number of things that are pretty gruesome. So one of the things that we have read about is that they had to, for example, take in a number of Taina heads, you know, so when they go out to war to fight, then they would have to prove themselves by taking in. And if they could take in the head of a Taina chief, much better, right? And so this is how one becomes a warrior. But let's look at it a little bit more. In the Kalinago society, the existing leader can be threatened at any time by anybody who feels himself up to the task, up to the time, right? And so this individual can then decide that he wants to threaten or he wants to come forward for the position of the Ubuntu. And if he is successful, then the existing Ubuntu booted out and, sent away or whatever in shame, because it was always about prowess. And it was, in fact, very much meritocratic. So if you didn't earn it, if you couldn't pass the test to become a warrior, then what do you become? You become a religious leader, because you didn't cut it to become a warrior. And that is what that society was about. And so you see what I mean by it depends on the society that we're talking about, right? So that is the example of a meritocratic social structure. And then the Ubuntu goes to the top, right, more or less, and then he has some village headmen below him, and then the majority of the population. Of course, the women come all the way down the bottom because of how women were classified in that society. Now let's look at the closed system and define. So if we said the open means that you can move up or down or across, it means for the closed that there is no movement. Little, very, very little, or no movement in this kind of system. All right? And it says that there is inequality in the system. Obviously, once you have a stratified society, then there is inequality. But even more so in a closed system, because the individuals of that society do not have an opportunity to move from where they are, right? And so it is usually structured based on race or religion. And as we said, of course, if you're black, you're just black, unless you're going to do other things to make yourself look brown, right? But if when you do that, you notice the knuckles don't usually come clean. So it still tells you, say you're black. So you can try, but you're still black. And so what happens is that you cannot change your race, and therefore you are not able to change your position on the social structure. All right? So what am I talking about? What exactly am I talking about? I am talking about the plantation structure. So examine this pyramid for a little while, right? It's looking much better than the one I drew. And we are seeing a general structure here, very general structure. Of course, the blacks who are enslaved are at the bottom, and that base is wide, as you can see there. And then you have colored or mulatto in the middle. And in some cases, there are free blacks there too, in the very rare case that they are actually able to buy their freedom. And at the very top, you have the whites. Now, this is precisely a system that is based on race. And this was a closed system because you could not move from where you were just like that. And remember I said little or no, because there were cases in which, such as in Haiti, and I know you're going, Lord, this is a teacher, I love Haiti. Every time she references, it's Haiti she referencing. Well, because it has the right examples. In Haiti, for example, just before the revolution, there were a number of free blacks and a number of mulattoes who were rich and who owned plantations and so on. But they could not be at the top because they were not white. You understand? And so this is what we pay attention to when we are looking at this structure. Now we are going to go a little bit more into this structure when we come back from the break, yes? And then we will delve into it a little bit more and look at how this still affects Caribbean society. Stay tuned. There's much more when we return.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
Welcome back to our lesson. Let's pick up where we left off. So we were looking at the social structure of the plantation system. And this is a little clearer. So let's look at this one here now. There's a further divisioning. So we had originally just blacks at the bottom, mulattoes and free blacks, and then whites. But there's a further divisioning of this structure. Let's look at it. We have at the bottom here, two different groupings. At the very bottom, and then another grouping of blacks. So we have field slaves or predials at the bottom, and then there's a further divisioning of the field slaves. So we have first gang, second gang, third gang. You guess what could be in this gang? So the first gang is the strongest grouping, male and female. Second gang would be next in line, and the third gang we call the picnic gang or the hog meat gang. You guess why we say that. The riffraff goes into that gang. So if you lose a hand or a foot, or the very small children or very old, go into that gang. And then above the field slaves, we have domestics and skilled slaves. Domestics first and then skilled slaves at the top. So we're talking about the coopers and the blacksmiths and so on. And then the free blacks, who are below the mulattoes in a sense. And then in the white division, we have another divisioning. So at the very top of the whites, you have the plantation owners, his wife. Sometimes the plantation owners were absent, absentee plantation owners. But you have his attorney, who is in charge of the plantation, who lives in the great house. Then below that, there are the bookkeepers and the overseers and so on. And then you have a group of poor whites who don't own any property and who are also menially employed on the plantation. So there's a further divisioning on this plantation system. And believe me, it was very, very, very rigid. Now, we talked about the people who came across to the Caribbean. And so all of these people at some point contribute to what we call the social structure of the Caribbean, both in the past and in the present. All right? We don't need to go through all of them. The indigenous peoples and the Europeans, the Africans, and after enslavement, the East Indians and so on. All right? And we went into indentureship for the East Indians. Now, why are we looking at the people who came as a part of social stratification and as a part of the Caribbean system? It's because we're looking at the plantation as a feature, right? And in some ways, as we're going to discuss, the feature called the plantation still has a lot to do with the political, the economic, and the social systems of the Caribbean. So under the plantation system, there's a small number of whites who are the owners and the employers, right? The employers, a large number of blacks who are the enslaved laborers, a mixed group in the middle, and this is fixed based on whiteness or blackness. And notice these terms that I'm using, whiteness or blackness, because it depends a lot on the shade of your skin. We're going to discuss that a little bit more, the shade of your skin. Let's compare the plantation system to the Indian caste system, which is another closed system of stratification. So this is the Indian caste system. Now, this one is not based on race because it is a society where all the people are the same race, but it's predominantly based on religious beliefs, right? So if you belong to the untouchables at the bottom here, the outcasts of the society, there is no way that you could actually become a part of any other group. So here are the features of the Indian caste. Ascribed status, which means that you attain it at birth, right? You cannot work for it. There's nothing you can do to achieve it. It's a closed system based on race, not based on race, I beg your pardon. Marriage outside of the caste is prohibited, so you have to intermarry within whichever caste you fall. Right? Wealth, level of education, power, prestige is determined by the strata to which one belongs. So if you're bad-lucked, as we'd say in Jamaica, bad-lucked enough to be born in the untouchables, we would say what? Dog nyam your supper. Now, modern Caribbean stratified system. Why do I say this? Because we still have a stratified system. It may not be caste or closed, but we still have a stratified system. What do we call this one? We call this a class-based system. All right? So you have the lower class there, may not be 8% or the percentages you see exactly, but the general idea, lower class, working class. And you notice the difference between those two? Lower middle class, upper middle class, and upper class. All right? And even within the upper class, you could have further layers and further divisions of that same society. Right? So we're seeing a modern stratified system. Now, what are the features? It is meritocratic. We already said it is a system of class, but it is also meritocratic, which means you have to earn it, much like, well, not precisely like how you would earn it in the Kalinago system, but you still have to earn it. You have to do something, all right? You achieve status. It's not necessarily the status you are born in, although we could argue that somewhat. Yes, that's debatable. Education is seen as the main means of upward social mobility. And then you have this group of people we call the intelligentsia. Yes? Those people who have higher education and who are grouped. So it doesn't matter if you're poor, you know, or how much pay you're taking home per month, you know, and I'm clearing my throat here as it relates to teachers because we are classified in the intelligentsia, you know, but we don't want to go down that road. And then we have marriage, acquisition of wealth, or entrepreneurship. So what do I mean here? I'm talking about persons who have acquired wealth, not necessarily through education. So we have a lot of athletes, and we have a lot of people in media and in what you call it now, music, because, you know, it's what we commercialize in Jamaica. And so these persons become a part of, you know, the upper class because of some acquisition of wealth, not necessarily through education. And we mentioned this term social mobility, but we need to talk about it just a little bit more because it is crucial to an understanding of social stratification in the Caribbean. And we would have defined it in all of our, you know, going on so far. The extent to which individuals are able to move amongst social classes, the extent to which. So you look at a society and you determine, is social mobility something that is readily done or is easy in that society, or is it something that, you know, is very, very difficult? The extent to which it is done. Movement can be upward, downward, or lateral. How can it be downward? I think we know how it can be upward, but how can it be downward? If you lose your job or if you lose some kind of status somehow, you know, maybe you won the lottery and it placed you in the golden triangle, that's where you live, and then something happened, some bad investment, and you don't no longer have this amount of money, and so you move downward, you know, you come down to the rest of us mortals, and that's where you live. And so you can actually fall down, you can move down, because wealth is a factor that influences social mobility in our society. Now, in some cases, pigmentocracy, that big word, pigmentocracy, sound like we're talking about pigs, not quite. When we talk about pigmentocracy, we're talking about the shading of someone's skin, you know, the extent to which you are brown or darker, you know. And so we know that in Jamaica, we have different shades, right? So we range from very, very dark to very, very light. Yes. And so you determine, people are sometimes, you know, work and so on, are determined by the shading of your skin. Yes? It was once so. Is it still so? Is pigmentocracy still a feature of Caribbean society? Did you know that one time, in order to work in the bank, you couldn't look like me to work in the bank? Not at all. I am too dark, one, and I have locks, two. I could not work in the bank, right? So in order to work in the bank at one point in Jamaica, and this was well after enslavement and well after independence too, I might add, you had to be very, very fair-skinned, and you had to if you did not have some kind of light Indian looking hair, you would have had to cream out your hair. You could not wear your natural hair as we are doing so and loving so much now, right? And so we are asking the question, is this still so? I mean, when you look at banks now, lots of dark-skinned people are working there with natural hair, afro, and all kinds of things. But in other sectors, is it still a factor? Can we identify any other sector of the society where pigmentocracy still is an important feature? Think about it. And then perhaps you can tell me when you send your questions in. Now, we want to examine pigmentocracy as it relates to George Beckford's plantation model. In 1983, George Beckford argued that the plantation was a total institution, and elements of this model are still evident in Caribbean society. Well, that was all the way 1983. That was before I was born. So, does it still exist? As a total institution, the plantation controlled the political, economic, and social systems. In other words, everything else had to do with the smooth running of the plantation and ensuring that sugar was planted and that the planters were making money from this planting of sugar. So people's movement were restricted. People's movements were restricted as it relates to how it affected planting of sugar, you know? And so everything that was done during the period of the actual plantation system had to do with how much of the sugar is planted and how much profit the planter could make. Monoculture, this one crop situation, just sugar alone, right? And we all know sugar cannot eat, but one crop was planted. The actual plantation may have been dismantled, but evidence exists of its continued influence in the political, economic, and social structure of post-colonial Caribbean society. Can you think of any evidence that may exist? I'm hearing you from all the way in St. Elizabeth and St. Thomas. What do you think? Do we have elements of the plantation system today? You know, it's a common saying. Sometimes you work somewhere, and just based on how maybe administration acts and so on, you say, yes, we are going to the Bakra Master plantation. You know? But does that mean that the elements of the plantation still exist? All right? So these are questions we want to ask, that we want to look at. And these are things that you will have to engage with in your writing as a student of Caribbean Studies. So we say we have the model of George Beckford's Plantation Society. We know the features of the society, and we examine the relevance in contemporary Caribbean, and of course we conclude. And this is just a general trajectory of how we would look at this issue of the plantation still as a feature in today's society. Let's move right along. Because George Beckford's theory is not the only theory that exists. That is a Caribbean theory. But we have some larger structural theories that we can look at as they relate to social stratification. Some of them are at the top of the list: Marxism, functionalism, interpretivism, and feminism. And you know, feminism, we're not going to look at all of them today. You can do your reading on them. But feminism, so very important in this system of stratification, because I don't think that we had mentioned any time previously that sex, or in some cases gender, because sex simply means biology, male or female, and gender is a larger societal construct. So perhaps we could say gender here. Gender plays a role in stratification. To what extent is this true in Caribbean society? Is it so? For some societies, it is a major, major issue. Middle Eastern societies, their stratified system is completely based on gender, Because if you are a female, then there's no way that you are able to do certain things or certain privileges are available to you. So that is also a very important factor. But in the Caribbean, women can go to the university, they can go as high as they want to go. When we talk about education. But is it so when women actually have to now launch out into the working world and look for those top jobs? Are women getting those jobs? Yes? Good question to think about. Now, for Karl Marx, the society is divided into two social classes, bourgeois and proletariat. The bourgeois are the owners of the means of production, the people who own the businesses and so on. They are the movers and shakers in this capitalist system. And the proletariat are the workers. They don't own anything but their labor, right? And so they give their labor and they're exploited by the bourgeois. That is what Marx says. Now, Marx saw the working class as lacking consciousness. He said they need to rise up, and rebel against the bourgeois in order to ensure that there's a more egalitarian society, that all the resources of the society are shared equally for everybody who live in this society. There should be no divisioning, no inequality should exist in societies, because what it does is that it perpetrates exploitation of people, right? And it is the stuff that racism is born of, So this is what Marx says. And so communist systems, such as what exists in Cuba, is a direct offshoot of Marxist ideology. So Marx says the proletariat must rise up and overthrow the bourgeois. All right? Now, the functionalist system, it says that stratification is functional. It is functional, direct opposite of what Marx says. Can you see that? Because it encourages competition, and people don't become lazy and think, oh, I have something that is, it just falls into my lap. No. It causes people to have to work hard for what they want. It allows them to learn, to grow, and to improve, and to work hard for their standard of living. That is what functionalists say. That is important to have a stratified society, so that people don't become lazy. All right. So we have looked at some of the theories, and as I said, you need to go and do your own reading on the feminist perspective, on the interpretivist perspective, and other perspectives that exists as it relates to social stratification. And we have explored social stratification in general. And, the Caribbean theories defined the major terms and so on. So we want to pick your brain a little bit. I love to come with this brain thing, yes, because your brain must be working. So let's pick your brain just a little bit. And I want to ask you this question, a very popular past paper question. I'm sure you should know by now that you will in fact be sitting 2 papers as well as the SBA this year for your exams. And so we have to begin to see how we can interact with questions that may come on the exam as it relates to the topics we are doing. So let's look at this question. Discuss the factors that affect social mobility in the Caribbean. 20 marks. Easy cheesy. Because you do have 30-mark questions that come. And so this one is pretty simple to start off. As we go along, we may do some more difficult questions. How would you approach this question? I know you're thinking about it already. Let's look at what could be included in your response. Some of the things that you must have. You must have your background, because you must be talking about enslavement and plantation society in order to be discussing stratification. You must have your definitions of terms, stratification and mobility and some of those other terms, pigmentocracy and so on. And not just to define them, but to use them properly while you are writing. You must have your theories, your major theories, and then your Caribbean theories. Functionalism, Marxism, feminism, interpretivism, and so on. You must have those as a part of your discussion. And then, of course, you must have the factors, because that's what the question asks you for. it asks you to talk about the factors that affect social mobility. So color, wealth, education, marriage, all of those things. Race, perhaps, but we don't necessarily have an issue with race in the Caribbean in terms of social stratification and mobility now. But we do have a problem with color, and color is quite different from race. Think about it, do some reading. So that should constitute your response. Those things must be included in your response. Let me go a little bit further to explain to you some of the nuances. Let's look at the introduction. How do you write a paper, a proper structured paper for Caribbean studies? You brainstorm first of all. That's why I have my brain there. You have to brainstorm, you have to think, you have to read, and you have to think. Begin to just jot down things as they come to you, ideas. And when you do this, you're not just clutching at things and just putting them into the paper as you see fit, but write down, make a plan, all right? And then you present your plan. Right? The introduction is important because it is the appetizer to the main course. Yes? So, like you like a nice bowl of soup or a salad, so you want to catch the examiner's eye, and you want to ensure that from the very get-go, you put yourself out there, and it shows that you know what you're talking about. All right? How do you approach the writing now after you come out of the introduction? Because for the introduction, some of the things that I named, the background and the theories and the major terminology must be coming out in your introduction. And then at the very end of your introduction, you will have your thesis statement, right? And your thesis statement says specifically what you want to posit in this paper, right? But how do you approach the rest of the writing? Here is a very good acronym you can use. PEEL. Point, explanation, example, and link. So every sentence that you write from here, say you're looking at each of the factors to form your paragraphs, right? Education. You must state your point. What's the point you're making? Explain, give some more details, give some example. And the example here could be a Caribbean country, that you want to explore in terms of how this particular situation is borne out. All right? And then you want to link back to your thesis statement. So every time you write, you link back to your thesis statement. And so you continue to repeat the PEEL process all the way through until your conclusion. All right? So how do you communicate this information now? Very quickly. You use proper grammar and expression, punctuation, all of those things. No points, no bullet points. You must be writing at the Cape level. Your spelling, all of those things must be on point. So you have to pay close attention to that. Now, just generally, because we're going to explore as we go along, how do you master the multiple choice? Now, you use the acronym READ, right? So for R, you read the question at least twice before you attempt to answer. E, you examine all the responses and eliminate the ones that are totally wrong. A, you attend to the key terms, and D, you determine the best answer based on the responses given. Now, I just want to share one question with you before we have to wrap up this lesson. Which of the following is not a characteristic of Caribbean society? We would have looked at these things, and we would have said homogeneity is the answer to that question. Now, this question gives you a statement and says you are to say which best summarizes. All right? And so the answer would be the functionalist perspective. Now, that's all we have time for today. And so we will have to explore more of these at another time. Be sure to do some reading on your own. And remember, you can send your questions at any time to Television Jamaica's Facebook page at Television Jamaica or Instagram at Television_Jamaica, or use the hashtag TVJClassTime. Stay tuned for CSEC Agricultural Science after the break.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
here. Interactive classes for all ages on the School Time channel on onespotmedia.com. With a combination of live Zoom classes and recorded class time, Schools Not Out lessons, and numerous educational content, we've created a comprehensive 24-hour channel dedicated exclusively to educating our nation's youth. Early childhood through to primary, secondary, and tertiary, it's one stop on one spot for education 24 hours. Brought to you by the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information in association with Television Jamaica Limited.
Welcome back to class time. It's time for CSEC Agricultural Science. I'm Janet White-Taylor, and I'll be your guide through today's lesson on housing for farm animals. So students, it's good to be back. I just want to encourage you before I go into the lesson to be strong in this difficult time. I know it's not easy, but education for you now is the most important thing, so stay focused. And so today we want to move straight into our lesson, housing for farm animals. At the end of this lesson, students, I hope you'll be able to achieve these objectives. 1, understand the principles that govern the housing requirements for farm animals. Describe appropriate housing and space requirements of broilers and layers. Describe appropriate housing for rabbits and pigs, and describe the establishment of a bee production system. We'll also go through the recap of the lesson, and we're going to look at some past paper questions as well. The first thing we need to know about housing, students, and it doesn't matter the type of animal, we need to know the purpose of that housing. And we want to look at the housing to know that if you're going to build housing for animals, that house must provide protection from bad weather or adverse weather condition, and also protection from predators. We need to understand that the requirements are important. So before we go in to build a house, we need to look at the requirements that we need to put in place. We already went through the purpose. We know that housing for animals must provide protection from adverse weather condition and also from predators. We need to look at other requirements, the location of the house, the site you're going to choose to put that house, the orientation of the house. That means how the house is aligned in an east to west direction or a north to south direction. Ventilation, how air is circulated into the house. Lighting, we're looking at what we call natural daylight in the day or electric light at nights. When we talk about security, we're also referring to predator control. How are we going to make sure that our animals are safe? And you know that in Jamaica, farmers have serious problems or challenges with predial larceny, where some persons like to steal from farmers and actually going to prevent them from making the profit that they should make. Good? We're talking about sanitation. The house for farm animals must be kept clean because you don't want your animals to come down with diseases. Safety, we're talking about biosecurity as well. The materials that you're going to use to make your house, they must be durable and can last for a very long time. And roofing is going to be critical as well because we want to make sure that our animals are protected. So we have just looked at the list of requirements. I now want to go through each of them to ensure that you understand the requirement for the housing for farm animals. Good? So we want to start by looking at the materials. The materials that we're going to use to build our houses for our farm animals, we get those materials either locally or imported materials. Good? So we want to look at lumber, for example. There are some lumber we are going to get locally. For example, our local trees, for example, the pine and cedar, they will give us the local lumber that we need. If we were to look at imported lumber, we are thinking of pitch pine, plywood, and chipboard. We must use the aggregates to ensure that we have a good and a strong foundation. We're talking about gravel, our sand, and cement. When we look at metals now in our region, most of the metals that we use, they are imported material. So when we talk about like our iron and steel beams, those things are important, and most of that is imported. When we talk about our roofing material, we are thinking about zinc and aluminum. If we are talking about imported material as well, we are thinking about, in terms of metals, we are thinking of galvanized roofing, sheets, and pipes. And then we have our local PVC pipes. We also, if we're talking about imported materials, the ceramics, we're going to have our tiles, our wash basins, and our sinks. And don't forget that the blocks that we use, we're going to be thinking of those concrete blocks or the clay blocks as well. So materials are important, students. And remember too, farmers, if you're going to be using lumber, if you want those lumber to last for a long time, you have to paint them, and also for your metal and steel as well, because you want those materials to be durable, especially in this weather that we have been having so much rain over the past couple of weeks. Good? Moving on now to look at roofing, because if we want to protect those animals from adverse weather conditions, we must have proper roofing. And these are some roofing we use in our region. We have what we call the shed roofing. Some farmers refer to that as lean-to roof. We have the gable roof. We have monitor roof, gambrel, Gothic roof, and also half monitor. These are just a few examples of the roofing we can put over the house of our farm animals. A next very important requirement is the location where you're going to put your house. We therefore must pay attention to the site, and we have to choose that site carefully. It's important because the site must provide stability of ground. That site must be well drained. It must also not be prone to flooding or landslides. And if you're going to set up house for your cattle, for example, you want to make sure that the house is near to the pasture. So the location plays a very, very important role. You can't just put your farmhouse near to a riverbank, because when there's flooding, you know you're going to be losing your house as well as your animals. And we can't afford to lose anything now, because we want to make sure that our farmers are able to provide for their families and to be able to do the things that they need to do. Let us recap by looking at this revision question. The diagram shows a design of housing for a particular animal. As you look at that house, students, I know you know the animal that should be in that house, right? The type of roof shown in the diagram is the answer A, a hip roof? Is it B, a gable roof? C, a lean-to roof? Or D, an insulated roof? Write down your answers. At the end of the presentation, I want you to match your answers with mine. Good? Because we have covered roofing so far, the purpose of building the house, and we have also looked at the materials and ensuring that we understand these requirements as we go now to look into the other requirements. Good? Are you still following me, students? I hope you're focused even in this time. So let us continue. Let us look at orientation. Orientation is a very important requirement because we are talking about how the house is going to be aligned. The house must be aligned in a certain direction in the Caribbean because we want to be able to reduce the buildup of heat inside that house. So when we talk about the alignment, it must give protection from the elements. The house must be aligned east to west and not north to south direction. It should be able to reduce the amount of direct sunlight entering the house and reduces the chilling effect of the northeast trade winds. Good? And so what I want to move on to look at, I want you to see the alignment of a poultry house. when it is aligned in the east to west direction or north to south direction. So what I have here is two diagrams, and I call diagram 1A and diagram 2B. So in diagram A, we are seeing this house is aligned in an east to west direction. You want to make sure that you understand that the solid wall to the house is aligned in the east to west direction. We are looking from very early in the morning. The sun comes up in the east. And this sun is going to go straight into that solid wall of this house. And so because we have the solid wall, it is going to take off some of the heat of this house. So the chickens that are inside this house, they are still going to be cool. The sun is going up now. We talk about the 10 o'clock sun. It is still hitting the side of the house and parts of the roof. The chickens in the side of this house, they are going to be cool and they are not going to start to feel hot. But by the midday sun, that sun is going to hit the roof of that house. And we are now going to start to have buildup of heat in the house. But by the 2 o'clock sun, it's moving away from the roof, hitting the side, the solid wall of the house, and so you're not going to have what we call all that sun going in, because this solid roof is going to be able to ensure that inside is going to be cooler. And by the late evening sun, it is hitting the solid wall. We are saying, and you need to understand, students, the importance of aligning the house in what we call the east to west direction. It reduces the buildup of heat inside the house. And so the animals will be able to produce and they'll be able to do very well, put on the weight very quickly and ready for the market if you're talking about the broilers. So A is the correct way for farmers to build their house. So farmers out there, pay attention and make sure that your house is aligned in an east to west direction. Let us look at another house. This farmer, he builds his house in a north to south direction. So we want to understand the solid walls are now facing north and south. So what you're having on the east and west side is what we call the area that you have the mesh wire and where we normally put up what we call our tarpaulin or the feeding bag to act as barricade. So we're looking at this house this morning. The morning sun is going to come up from the east. It's going to hit this house. It will go straight into this house because there's no solid wall to prevent the sun or to reduce the impact of the heat. By 10 o'clock sun, everything is right inside this house. From as early as 10 o'clock in the mornings, these chickens would now start to pant. They're going to be very hot. They're not going to be interested in eating. They are going to now want to drink water. By the midday sun, it's on the roof. This house is already very hot. And at this time now, they are drinking a lot of water and they are not eating. By you talk about the 2 o'clock sun and the evening sun, so for the entire day, this house is going to have a buildup of heat. This heat is going to prevent the chickens from eating as much as they should. And these animals is not going to put on weight as fast as these animals that are in the house that is aligned in an east to west direction. So do you understand the importance now? Good. So it's very important, farmers. Do not build your house and students in a north to west direction or orientation, but in an east to west direction. And that is done not only for broilers, but also for layers as well. We now want to move on to look at ventilation. When we talk about ventilation, we're talking about how air is going to circulate inside that house. It's very important. And that is why, for example, the broiler house, we are giving them those mesh wires, right? Because we want air to circulate inside that house. Good? When we have good ventilation, it is going to disperse the heat and the foul odor that is going to come from the house. Now, if you don't have good ventilation, students, when you enter your broiler house, you're going to get a good, strong scent of that ammonia gas rising out of that litter that is there. Good? And then you're going to realize that it is going to affect you as well as your neighbors. You also need to what we call ensure that air is circulated so that your animals are going to do well, especially when your house is oriented in the right direction. Good? So what we have covered so far, students, we have been looking at the requirements of how we are going to build our farmhouses. We have looked at the purpose. We have looked at the materials. We have looked at roofing. We have looked at orientation. and ventilation. So we want to move on now to look at other requirements. Remember now to pay attention because it's very important that you understand as I go through the lesson. Good? And so the next requirement we want to look at is lighting. Lighting, students, is very important. In the daytime, we want to use natural light, the daylight, as much as possible. It's very important because we have to now pay attention to our expenses. We don't want to be burning electric light during the day because we are looking at to make sure that we are able to make some profit. So during the day, we want to encourage you to use your natural light, but at night, the electric light is very important and necessary because good lighting is going to help to keep away the predators from your house. Good? And so the next one we want to look at is what we call predator control and security. In our Caribbean region, farmers suffer a lot from predial larceny. People just decide to just prey on them, go in, just when they're about to slaughter their animals, the animals are gone. So we want to make sure that we have secure fencing around our houses. If you're going to put on a padlock, don't just put on a little flimsy one. You want to make sure that it's a good one, you have quality, that you can secure your animals and you can put them in proper pens. Good? If you're going to do your wire mesh, like for your poultry and rabbits, make sure that it goes straight up to the walls of the ceiling. Floodlighting is very important too. You want to place them at strategic points around the building. And remember that we must make sure that we keep away stray cats, dogs, vampire bats, mongooses, rats, and thieves, because we want to make sure that at the end of their lives, we'll be able to make good money. So what we have looked at so far, students, we have looked at the purpose of having a house for our animals. We have looked at the materials and the type of materials that we use. We have looked at roofing. We have looked at orientation. We have looked at ventilation. And we have also looked at predator control and security. Is it clear so far, students? Good. I hope that you're taking your notes as well. And so the next requirement we want to look at, and this one is key. This is where many persons fall down in terms of house requirement. It is sanitation. Remember, students, animals cannot look after themselves. And we are the ones, because we are managers, we are practitioners of agriculture. And every agricultural science student, you have to now learn to manage. When you go into your house, you have to ensure that your house is clean. And there are certain things, we build the house in such a way to facilitate this. So what we normally do with the floor is always rough to facilitate easy cleaning and sloping a little. Good? So that we can get out all the wastewater and the effluent out of the house. Good? You must have what we call a channel inside your house, for example in your piggery, for speedy removal of effluent into a slurry pit or the biogas digester. And you also want to make sure that you have appropriate pathway for the removal of solid waste to the manure heap. These things are very important, students. If you do not want to go into your house to clean your house, your animals will come down with disease, and it's not going to be good for us as farmers because we are going to be losing money. You can't have a good start, and because you don't want to clean the house, you're going to lose so much. So we need to pay attention to that. So for example, in your piggery, you want to clean at least twice per week. And people like to think that pigs are dirty. They are not. If you give a pig a room, they are going to divide that room into different areas. They're going to have their dining room where they eat. They're going to have their bathroom where they're going to pass their waste. They're going to have their recreational area where they're going to just wallow and just have fun. And then they're going to have the area where they rest. The problem comes in when we do not practice good sanitation and we allow all that waste feces to be all over the place. It does not make the animals happy. And so if they are not happy, they'll not produce as well. Is that clear, students? Very good. And even for our broiler house as well, you want to make sure if there are wet areas in that house, you want to take that up and to add some dry litter into that house to make sure that your animals are doing well. Good? The next point we want to look at is safety. And when I talk about safety, I want to look at biosecurity first. When you have your farm out there, or your farmhouses, make sure that you don't accommodate anybody off the street to just walk into your farm and walk into your house. We have to make sure that the animals are safe and protected. So what we are saying to farmers and students at school, sometimes it's difficult. If you're not able to get what we call a ready-made foot bath, you can make your own. So you must have a foot bath at the entry points to the pen. Yes? Grill covers must cover your drains, and channels and pits must be there because you want to be able, as you clean, you're able to allow this air for your waste to run down and make sure that the place is also safe. You don't want to leave it where it's very slippery, and then you're going to slide and hurt yourself. And when we talk about exits, you must have several wide exits for speedy removal of farm animals in case of emergency. For example, if there's a fire, you don't have to say, let me drop this one on my back. You're able to move them quickly out. If there's flood, you can move your animals quickly out as well. So pay attention to these things because safety is very, very important. And students, even you sometimes raising your chickens at home. So when you come onto the school farm, you then have to put your feet into that foot bath, leave everything there, and then you go into your house. Because we don't want what you have at home in your fowl house to be in the ones that we have at school. Good? Very good. And so we have just wrapped up, students, the requirements that we need in order to build a farmhouse that will provide protection from adverse weather conditions and also from predators. Remember, students, many predators are out there, but we want to make sure that our animals are safe. So do you understand now? Housing for farm animals, and all these things are critical and very important, especially orientation. Let us move on now to look at housing for broilers and layers. Now, when we construct our house, we're talking about the house must have at least what we call 10 meters wide and a conventional length. But for us at school, we are thinking of what we call the standard width. And we're looking at what we call 300 centimeters or 3 meters in width. Good? When we talk about our roof, we can use either aluminum or zinc roof. And you want to also make sure that the eaves extend to about 1 meter to keep out rain. Good? You want to have what we call a brick wall from the floor up to about 30 to 40 centimeters high to retain litter in a deep litter system. Good? We want to also ensure that you put up your barricades using your feedbacks or your tarpaulin around the house, and the doorway must be at least 1 meter wide, and there must be sufficient ventilation inside that house so that your animals will be able to produce and to do well. The requirements for the housing is very important. And you must ensure that if the time becomes very windy and cold, you have those barricades there. You can go and use the feed bags, sew them together, or get the tarpaulin where you can take them up in the day and you're able to lower them at night. These things are very important for the well-being of our animals. Because inside your house, students, you're going to have your brooding taking place. Your brooder is going to be there. If the animals are too cold, the baby chickens are going to huddle together and they're going to die. They're going to be sleeping, getting warm, and they just die. If inside the house is too hot, they're going to move away to the perimeter of the brooder and they're not going to be eating and drinking. So the temperature inside the house, based on the orientation, how you build the house, have a lot to do with how we are going to control temperature in the house. Not just for our broilers, but also for our layers. Good? So what we have looked at so far are the requirements for the farmhouse. We have looked at housing for broilers and layers. We now want to move in to look at the systems under which we raise our broilers and layers in our region. And we normally look at, when we talk about systems of production, We have what we call the intensive system. That means the animals are in a house. We have the semi-intensive system where these animals, they are outside in a yard during the day, but at night we take them in and we lock them away to make sure that they are safe. And then we have the extensive system. Like how we have the common fowls at home. They can run about in the yard and they are able to fend for themselves. Good? And so now I want to look at the deep litter system. Once we talk about the deep litter system, and we use the word litter, we are referring to putting material on the floor of your house so that when the chickens pass their waste, it will be absorbed, the droppings will be absorbed by the litter material that you have on the floor. We use many different types of litter materials, students, in our region. For example, we use wood shavings, we use bagasse, we also use rice hull, we could use dry grass, we could even use shredded newspaper. All of that is litter material that we can put on the floor. When we put the litter down, it must be at a height so that we'll be able to store it so it will always remain dry inside the house. So the depth of that litter material would be about 10 to 15 centimeters on the floor of the pen, or you could go up to what we call 6 inches, 4 to 6 inches. Good? Once you have that, you know that you're at a good place with raising your chickens. The litter must be stirred once or twice per week. Sometimes you're going to have some leaking waterers. If it's leaking and the area becomes very wet, you want to get your spade and bag, go into that house, make sure that you put your foot in, make sure you clean yourself there with a foot bath. You don't take anything from outside inside your house. And then you're going to spade that up, take it outside, then you're going to get dry litter to put there to ensure that your animals will be doing well. If the litter becomes very wet, students, the chickens can come down with a cough. They will get a cold. They will cough and wheeze and sound almost as if they're asthmatic. And if animals are sick, they will not produce and do well. So how we look at the house and take care of the house is going to be very important, what we are going to have at the end of the time when we need to slaughter them. Spacing is very important as well. You want to space the broilers, for example, 4 to 5 birds per meter square, and for layers, 3 birds per meter square. And if you're looking at the picture here, you're seeing that this is a deep litter system for layers, and we are saying that the perches must be there for roosting and nest boxes for egg layings, as you can see what they are doing there right now. And you're seeing the amount of space they have because the layer stays a longer time in the house, up to a year, over a year, so they must have good spacing inside that house. Litter is looking quite dry and healthy, I must say. Good? We're now going to look at the next system under the intensive system of raising our broilers, and we call that the battery cage system. We are placing the chickens, or these layers, into little wire cages, sometimes 1 bird per cage or up to 4 or 5 birds per cages. And sometimes the cages are stocked one on top of each other. Some persons think that this system is unnatural and cruel. So let us take a look at it. So these are the animals in these small cages. You're going to have their feeding trough. It's going to be on the outside that they can eat. And then when they lay their eggs, it's going to now roll down into what we call this area right here so that you can have easy collection of the eggs. And then underneath the wire cages, you want to put a tray there to collect all their waste. But most persons prefer to use the deep litter system and not the battery cage system. Students, what do you think? Which one do you prefer? I prefer to, like you, the deep litter system. Good? Now, there's something that we need to work out, students, and you must do this for your CSEC examination. You need to know how to work out the space requirement for broilers as well as layers. And so once we talk about space requirements, students, if we know the space requirement for 1 chicken, 1 broiler or 1 layer, then we're able to work out the space requirement for any amount of layers we want to raise inside our house. And if we are going to raise chickens, we need to give them the proper spacing. If we overstock these broilers, for example, it's going to affect how they're going to produce. you want them to have enough space to eat and also to drink. So when you're going to raise chickens, you want to put, for example, 1 feeder to 25 chickens and 1 water to 25 chickens. So spacing is key inside your house. Let us now look at the space requirement, and I use this example for 75 broilers. So we know that this is a space requirement for 1 broiler, 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, which would give us 900 centimeters square, or 0.09 meters square. Because we know the spacing for 1 broiler, we can then work out the spacing for 75 broilers, 100 broilers, or whatever amount you're raising at your school. So we are now going to say 75 broilers multiplied by the spacing for 1 broiler, which is 900 centimeters square, would give us 65,500 centimeters square, or if we're working with meters square, it would have been 6.75 meters square. So it's not so difficult. This is a standard. Once you know the standard, you can work out the space requirement for your chickens. Now, students, we now want to work out the width. And we need to work out what we call the length, because at school, we are using a standard width of 300 centimeters. So we know that area is equal to length times width. We know the area already. Good. We know the width already, standard 300 centimeters. And so what we now want to find is the length. And so we are going to put the total of the area over the width in order for us to get the length. Good? And as you can see, we worked out it and we are able to get 225 centimeters for the length, as shown here. And so when you go back to do the maths, 300 multiplied by the 225 centimeters is going to go back to give us the area for 67,500 centimeters. Would have been the space requirement that we are going to need for 75 broilers. You can now work it out now at home for any amount of broilers you want to raise. Let us now move on to look at the space requirement for our layers. As I said before, students, the broilers are in your house for up to 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes we take them out at 5 weeks based on the weight and what your markets require. If your markets need your chickens as 3.5 pounds, you can take them out at 5 weeks. However, even though broilers are staying inside the house for a short time, you must understand that layers are going to require more time, and if it's more time, it is going to be more space. So now we want to be able to look at the space requirement for our layers. Good? And the space requirement for 1 layer, this is standard 0.9 meter by 0.9 meter. We're going to get 0.81 meters square, or we could get 8,100 centimeters square. This is a space requirement for 1 layer. So they need more space than the broilers. Good? So once we know the space requirement for 1 layer, we can work out the space requirement for 40 layers. And when we work that out, we are getting the 40 layers by the 1 space requirement of 0.81 meters square. We now end up with 32.4 meters square. We could convert that to centimeters, and we have 324,000 centimeters square. We do the same thing as well to work out the length. We know the standard width, 300 centimeters. We're then going to divide by the area to get our length. When you multiply them again, you're getting back the same area. So you want to make sure you can check to make sure that your answers are right. So you're doing that to work out the length, just to make sure that the information that you have there is correct. Not difficult, students, but it requires practice. Good? Very, very important. So what have we looked at so far, students? We have looked at the requirements in order for us to build our farmhouses. Good? We have looked at the housing for broilers and layers. And if we are going to raise chickens, we need to know how many chickens to put in a space. And so we have just worked out the space requirement that is required for our broilers and our layers. Is that clear, students? Good. And I'm glad that it is clear to you. Sometimes we may decide to overstock. If you're carrying out an experiment for your SBA, you want to maybe overstock or understock, because sometimes we want to know how stocking density is going to impact the weight that chickens put on. And students, you need to try these experiments and carry out your comparative studies for your SBA. So try it, get the same space requirement. You can understock or overstock, and then you can let me know. Because you and I know that if chickens have a lot of space, they're going to run up and down and lime. They are now going to convert their fat into muscle. The less space you give them, all they are able to do is to eat, drink, and to sleep, and then they'll be able to put on more weight. But carry out the experiment, and you let me know what is best for your chickens. More space or less space? Good? And so we have wrapped up chickens, and now want us to go now to look at rabbits, because rabbits are very important to us now in the Caribbean. Good? They are easy to raise, don't cost a lot, and the meat, the quality of the meat is very good. Very, very tasty. So, once we talk about housing for rabbit students, we want to make sure that we are raising those houses about 3 feet off the ground. We want to make sure that they are protected from predators as well. And so once we make the house, we then must also pay attention to orientation. The house must be aligned in an east to west direction. Good? We want to protect them from, make sure that we have the proper roofing. We want to have the sides solid and also the back. We want to take off some of that northeast trade wind as well. And so to the front, we're having what we call these wire meshes so that you're going to have some amount of ventilation taking place. And then you have your door because you want to make sure that your animal is safe. So the hutches must be well ventilated. They must protect the animals from adverse weather conditions and also from predators. And then also the floor is going to be mesh because you want the air to circulate even better. So that when they pass their waste, it is now, you have what we call a tray here to collect their feces. Bear in mind, students, that we must have what we call a sitting board inside the hutch. Because you and I know that rabbits, they eat their night feces in order to get more nutrients. And that is what we term as coprophagy. So the board must be there so that they can re-eat their feces at nights. Is it clear? Good. So students, we have looked at the broilers and layers. We have looked at the rabbits. I want us now to move on to look at pigs. And once we are going to build housing for pigs, we have to make sure that the pigs are also well protected and that there is air is circulated inside the house as well. But before we move on to look at pigs, I want to recap with you by looking at a past paper question. And I don't want you to only try to answer multiple choice questions. You have to be able to answer those essay type questions as well, especially for the students if you're doing single award or double award. So we are looking at a past paper question from paper 2, which double award students and single award students will be able to do. So let's go through the question. In the Caribbean region, broilers are reared in poultry pens where heat buildup can be substantial during the midday hours. The diagram represents a typical poultry pen. Study the diagram and answer the questions below. Let us study the diagram, students. What we're looking at the diagram, we are seeing now the orientation of the house. And I know you can tell me the orientation. Is it east to west or is it north to south? Yes, it is north to south. And remember what we say about the orientation of the house. We are seeing the roof, slightly sloping roof. We are seeing the eave extend out to about 1 meter. We are seeing the low solid wall. We are seeing the door. We're seeing the footbath because we want to make sure that we are protecting the animals inside. And we are seeing the wire mesh. This house is saying that it is not oriented well, but we are seeing ventilation. Good? Now, it says suggest one way of improving the design of the pen to reduce the buildup of heat. And what we are going to do, we are making sure that the house will be oriented in an east to west direction. And you want to now explain how this design in terms of orientation, east to west, will be able now to improve the design of your house. Now, students, that is it for today's lesson. We are going to continue next time. And so, if you have any questions, send them to Television Jamaica's Facebook page at Television Jamaica or Instagram at Television_Jamaica or use the hashtag TVJ Class Time. Up next, Cape Biology.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
Hello again, CAPE students. I'm Alison Peart, and this is Biology for Grade 12. Last week, we looked at biological molecules, specifically water. We'll continue in that same vein, but with a different biological molecule. Today, we delve into carbohydrates. So let's get into it. Let's get into our lesson. Today, we'll look at carbohydrates, and the specific objectives are: on completion of this section, you should be able to describe the structure of the ring form of glucose, state the difference between the alpha and beta glucose, describe the structure of sucrose, and explain the difference between the structure of glucose and sucrose. In addition, we're going to be looking at more complex carbohydrates, the all-important starch, glycogen, and cellulose. We're going to look at the whole biological principle of structure relating to function. Structure presenting certain properties which confer the ability for these molecules to perform specific functions. And so, we're going to move on now to look at carbohydrates as organic compounds that have the following properties. First of all, they contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. I'm sorry. Now remember, last week we spoke about the 4 important elements that constitute biological molecules: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. In the case of carbohydrates, however, the nitrogen is absent. And so you have the general formula of carbohydrates being CX, open bracket, H2O, close bracket, subscript Y. And it's interesting because the name carbohydrate is derived from the fact that it constitutes the carbon molecule, atom for carbo, and hydrate because hydrate represents water. If you notice that in the general formula, the percentage or the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen atoms is always 2 to 1, as in the case of the molecule of water, which is H2O. In addition, carbohydrates are categorized according to their structure. So we have the monosaccharides, and remember the prefix mono means one. The suffix saccharides means sugar. So a monosaccharide is a simple sugar, for example, glucose. There are other monosaccharides, and we discuss that later. We also have the disaccharides, and the prefix di means 2. So 2 sugar units, like in the case of sucrose. And then we have the polysaccharides. Now, poly means many. So many sugar units, for example, starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So let's look in more detail, in greater detail, at the simple sugars. The simple sugars are monosaccharides, and remember I spoke about the formula, C subscript X, open bracket H2O, close bracket Y, in which X represents or is 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 carbon atoms. The glucose with the formula C6H12O6 is one great example and a very common one of a simple sugar. Now, the glucose molecule will exist as a straight chain or straight chains and as rings, but most often glucose exists in the ring form, which is far more stable. Now, there are 2 ring forms that are dependent on the position of the H and the OH groups about the carbon atom at position 1. And I want you to remember this because it's important in terms of how the glucose molecules bond together to polymerize or form macromolecules. Now, the 2 forms are named alpha with the OH below the ring, and I show you that in a moment, and beta with the OH above the ring. Now, these 2 forms of glucose are polymerized, or they link to form macromolecules with very different properties and roles. So let's have a closer look. If you, at first glance, you know, they seem to look identical. In fact, they have the same molecular formula, but different structural formula. If you look carefully, you'll see that here the OH, as had been said before, is below the ring at the carbon 1 position, whereas in the beta glucose, it's above the ring. And if you notice, I have numbered the carbon atoms for you, which would be at each point. So this is carbon 1, carbon 2, carbon 3, carbon 4, carbon 5, and carbon 6 is branching off from carbon 5. If you notice that, in the case of beta glucose, the OH group is above the ring. So you have the carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the OH group is above the ring. And please remember the structural makeup of those two forms of glucose. We call them isomers. Now, glucose has 6 carbon atoms, and it's an example of what we call a hexose sugar. Now, remember, hex, that prefix means 6. In the same way that tri means 3, yes? Penta means 5. Hex means 6. And of course, hepta, like heptathlon in the Olympic Games, heptathlon, 7 events. Heptose would be a 7 carbon sugar. Now, there are other hexose sugars that like fructose, which is fruit sugar, and galactose, which is actually the monosaccharide that combines with glucose to form the disaccharide lactose. Now, in days gone by, there used to be baby food that we call lactogen. I don't know if you students would know about that, but if you ask your parents, they would tell you about the popular lactogen. Lacto means milk. So lactose, milk sugar, and galactose is the monosaccharide that combines with a common glucose molecule to form the disaccharide lactose. Now, glucose is a polar molecule, and remember last week we spoke about polarity and that water is a polar substance, and polar substances like sodium chloride is very soluble in water. Glucose, we know, is very soluble, is very water soluble. As a matter of fact, in days gone by, you used to have little babies, newborn babies, being fed with glucose because it was thought to be a very quick and efficient source of energy. It gets straight to the bloodstream in no time. And that is why it is a form of carbohydrate that is transported in the blood of animals. And in plants, it is readily taken up by cells and metabolized. Because remember now, glucose is one of the first form substances in the process, the food-making process by plants called photosynthesis. It provides a source of energy, therefore, from the process of respiration. I am not sure if you remember we used to have athletic meets, and then you might see the athletes being given doses of glucose, and they're licking the glucose, expecting to do well because it will give them a burst of energy. But alas, if you can't run like Usain Bolt, you might not very well make it to the line. So glucose is a very quick source of energy from the process of respiration. It is able to be polymerized to form polysaccharides for energy storage. And we'll speak about that when we deal with the complex carbohydrates later. It's also used as a raw material to make compounds like disaccharides. So glucose and fruit sugar fructose will link together or bond to form sucrose. And sucrose is like cane sugar or the brown sugar that we use in our homes to sweeten things. Other common monosaccharides that you'll come across are the pentoses, and those are important in the formation of the all-important DNA molecule. And those would have 5 carbon atoms, whereas the trioses would have 3. Now let's have a look at the monosaccharides, how they join together to form complex sugars known as disaccharides. The diagram below, and I'm going to show you in the next slide, shows how this happens in plant cells that make sucrose from glucose and fructose. Now, in the reaction, which is called a condensation reaction, a molecule of water is removed so that you form an oxygen bridge, and I'll show you that in a moment, between carbon 1 of the glucose molecule and carbon 2 of the fructose molecule. That the bond that is formed is known as a glycosidic bond, so named because a glycoside is a ring-formed sugar compound. And the type of reaction, as I said before, is a condensation reaction because water is formed. You know, in the mornings when you get up, all the plants have droplets of water on it. That's due to condensation overnight from water vapor to liquid water. So we call it a condensation reaction because a molecule of water is formed. Now the glycosidic bond, please note, it's a type of covalent bond. And remember last week we learned that the covalent bond is very strong as compared, for example, to the hydrogen bond. Now I want you to take a closer look at the diagram there. It shows you the molecule of glucose being added to the molecule of fructose and the resultant sucrose molecule plus water. And remember I mentioned the oxygen bridge, which is formed right there. That's the oxygen bridge, and the water molecule is given off to confer on it the term condensation reaction. In fact, sucrose is never formed in that simple way. The reaction is far more complex, but for our purposes, we're going to look at it in this simple form, and the formation involves, remember, the elimination of water as shown. Sucrose is formed by plants and it's transported in the phloem tubes through the plant from what we call the source, where it is produced by the process of photosynthesis, to where we call the sink. Those are the areas where you'd probably have them being used in metabolic or chemical reactions, or maybe stored in the fruits, the seeds, the flowers, the roots, the stems. All those are the storage areas. Now, sucrose is also a polar and therefore water-soluble substance, but it's not as reactive as glucose and fructose because the aldehyde, and you would have learned about the aldehyde and ketone groups from your organic chemistry classes in CSEC biology and chemistry. So you would know about those compounds, and those aldehyde and ketone groups form the glycosidic bond, and they are not available to react. So the lack of reactivity of the sucrose molecule is important in its role as the transport form or in translocation of produced substances in the source, that's the leaf of the plant, to where it's going to be stored elsewhere in the plant. So there's an advantage there to have a less reactive sugar for transport in plants, as the transport is slower than that of glucose in animals. I just want to mention the fact that if you notice, here we have the OH in red and the H in red. That is going to be linking to form the water molecule, and then this oxygen will form the glycosidic bond, which is really at the oxygen bridge. Just to point out to you, and if you notice, the carbon atoms are numbered as well for your better understanding. We're going to move on now to the complex carbohydrates. Glucose and other monosaccharides, they are referred to as monomers. Now remember, the prefix mono means one. So one unit will combine with another, with another, with another, until you have polymers or macromolecules with many units known as polysaccharides, and these are used for energy storage and for making cellulose for cell walls, and that would be the other polysaccharide that we're going to be looking at. And just to remind you that when we have the digestive process in man, for example, and we take in starch, cooked starch, it is going to be digested, absorbed, and taken via the hepatic portal vein to the liver. Now, in the liver, you're going to have, if you have excess glucose molecules produced from a meal, maybe you ate a lot, or you ate a lot of sugary substances, and you are in a resting phase, so you're not using up the energy, you'll find that that excess glucose would have to be stored, and it's stored in the form of that biological molecule called glycogen. We're going to discuss that a little later. But polysaccharides, therefore, are made from many monomers, and the previous figure shows a glucose monomer added to the end of an existing chain with the formation of a glycosidic bond. And if you notice, I keep repeating the information because repetition is the mother of learning. And I want you to really understand. There are some of you who would be way ahead and are quite all right with what is being taught. But there are some students who are not as ready, and they're the ones I have to cater to as well. So don't you mind the repetition, because it is the source of learning. Now, the glycosidic bonds that form between carbon 1 and the end of the growing chain, carbon 4 of the glucose monomer that is being added, they are known as a 1,4 glycosidic bond. So, for example, if you consider this as a polymer, and each of these beads would be a glucose molecule, and I'm taking the first one. So carbon 1 would be at this side, then carbon 4 would be of the next monomer that I'm going to be adding would be closer to it, and so it's a carbon 1 connecting with carbon 4 to form the glycosidic bond. And that is why it is called 1,4 glycosidic bond, because of the carbon atoms to which the bonding or the link is going to be made. If all the glucose monomers are added in this way and you get an unbranched chain, the unbranched chain is formed, then the branching point is formed by adding a glucose monomer to the carbon 6 on a growing chain. And let me just go back a bit to show you where, carbon 6 would be here, and so the link would be made here if you want to have a branching aspect to the chain. And we're going to discuss the complex carbohydrates which have branching chains. So the previous figure showed that the glucose monomer added to the end of an existing chain with the formation of a glycosidic bond. Now, the type of glycosidic bond that forms to make these branching points is not a 1,4 glycosidic bond, but a 1,6 glycosidic bond. And it's simply telling you which carbon atoms are connecting to form that glycosidic bond. From the first monomer added, another chain can form with more 1,4 glycosidic bonds, joining the glucose monomers together. Now, there are 3 energy storage polysaccharides: amylose, amylopectin, and glycogen. Now, you may remember when you did your CSEC biology that when we ingest cooked starch, it is digested by an enzyme called salivary amylase. Now, if it's starch, and you usually have the enzymes being named for the sugar that it's acting on or the substrate that it's acting on, then if it's sucrose, acted on by sucrase, lactose by lactase, then if it's starch, then it should be starchase. Not really. It's actually salivary or pancreatic amylase. Why amylase? Because the starch molecule, it consists of amylose and amylopectin. They are forms of starch, and I want you to remember that. So because amylose and amylopectin are forms of starch, then the enzyme that acts on it is called amylase. Now, glycogen, the third one, is also an energy storage polysaccharide, and I had discussed that earlier. Amylose and amylopectin, as I mentioned, are forms of starch. Glycogen, which is sometimes referred to as animal starch because it is only found in animals, then the glycogen is similar to amylopectin, but it has more 1,6 glycosidic bonds than amylopectin, and therefore has many more branches. Now, glycogen, as I mentioned, called animal starch, and the 3 energy storage polysaccharides are made from alpha and beta glucose monomers. I think that's incorrect. I think it's alpha glucose monomers alone, because cellulose, which is the third polysaccharide complex carbohydrate that we're going to study is a long chain molecule made from beta glucose monomers only. It is not used for energy storage, but for making the cell walls of plants. And if you remember, we always speak of the cellulose cell walls of plants. If you notice, each of these, it's like the B that I have there, each of these is a glucose unit that's linked together by glycosidic bonds. And these are the beta glucose molecules. And then they are lined up in parallel forms. And if you notice here, it's almost like, I'm not sure if you know what a crocus bag is like. You know, nowadays you children aren't so familiar with these old time things. But notice that this here represents the cell wall of a plant cell. And it shows how the cellulose is structured in a linear manner. And the fact is that cellulose is a polysaccharide that performs a structural function, not for storage, as in the case of starch. Now, if you notice, starch and glycogen are branched. And in the case of starch, it is not as branching and compact as glycogen. Notice if you did the test for starch on a leaf, for example, all these dark areas here are the blue-black coloration that you'll get when you use iodine in potassium iodide solution to test for starch. And then the third image shows you glycogen, which is usually stored in the liver and the muscles of animals. Remember, glycogen is referred to as animal starch because it's only found there. Now, what I've done is to create for you a table that will encapsulate and pretty much give you a chance to analyze and to put together all the information that I've shared with you this morning. If you have a look at the headings, polysaccharides, monomers from which they are made, the type of glycosidic bonds, the structure as a result of that, the bonds and the monomers used, and then the functions that they perform. So the first one, starch, made up of amylose and amylopectin. If you notice, amylose has monomers of alpha glucose combined to form combined and linked by glycosidic bonds. The structure as a result are unbranched chain right-handed helix structure, and it's suited for energy storage in plants. Then we have amylopectin, the monomers, alpha glucose, and the glycosidic bonds involved, 1,4 and 1,6 glycosidic bonds, and you need to remember this information. The structure as a result, branched chain, and it's not a helix. You remember we spoke of a double helix, a kind of spiral that you'd see in the DNA molecule. That's what a helix is. And the function, energy storage in plants. Then we have glycogen. Glycogen is also referred to as animal starch, and the monomer involved is the alpha glucose. The glycosidic bonds, 1,4 and 1,6. The structure resulting, branched chain, more branched than the amylopectin. And remember, we looked at it. It was very dense and highly branched. And the energy storage in animals, fungi, and some bacteria. The final polysaccharide is cellulose. Cellulose constitutes monomers, the beta glucose. And the glycosidic bond would be the 1,4 glycosidic bond. So if you notice, amylose and cellulose are joined by glycosidic bonds that are 1,4 glycosidic bonds. The amylopectin and glycogen, which are quite similar, both have 1,4 and 1,6 to give branching structures. And you notice that amylose is unbranched, it's an unbranched chain, and cellulose is also an unbranched but straight chain. The cellulose is grouped together in bundles within the plant cell walls, and it has a high tensile strength, almost equivalent to that of steel, which you know is quite strong. Now, let's look again at the structure and function, the relationship between structure and function of these polysaccharides. The storage polysaccharides are insoluble in water, they are unreactive and compact. And if you wish, you can get some starch and you can add it to water, tap water and stir it, and you'll notice that there will be, it's quite insoluble and it will not form a solution as glucose would. Amylose and amylopectin, they are stored in plant cells, and starch grains and glycogen have branches. They have many places where glucose can be added or removed as required by a cell. Now, alternate beta-glucose molecules are arranged at 180 degrees to each other as they are added to a growing cellulose molecule. And this gives a straight chain. Remember I said it's not a helix, which is spiral, with many projecting OH groups on both sides of the chain to form hydrogen bonds with adjacent cellulose bonds and adjacent cellulose molecules. A bundle of cellulose molecules, as I had shown in the picture, bonded together by hydrogen bonds, forms a microfibril, and that is very strong. Now, the microfibrils are arranged in plant cell walls in a crisscross pattern to provide even more strength. And if I go back to that picture, if you notice the crisscross pattern in that first lower left-hand corner where the polysaccharides in cells, you'll see the crisscross pattern of the cellulose chains. Now, to look closer at the cellulose, the structure of cellulose, that in the far left-hand corner, you'll see the plant matter. And if you should pull out the cellulose fiber, you get a macrofibril. And here we have, pulling out again, a microfibril. And when you look at the fine structure of it, these are really chains of cellulose molecules. Now, if it has this kind of structure, and this one is an example of cellulose fibers from a ponderosa pine, I have a feeling it might have something to do with the cowboys in the days of Bonanza. So cellulose fibers from a ponderosa pine might be found in the desert. The macrofibrils compose each fiber, and each macrofibril is composed of bundles of microfibrils. The microfibrils are in turn composed of bundles of cellulose chains, and the cellulose fibers can be very strong. And this is one reason why wood, for example, is such a good building material. Now, before I get to quiz time, perhaps we could recap a bit what we have looked at today. First of all, looking at carbohydrates made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in various proportions. We looked at the simple sugars like glucose, fructose, and the disaccharides. Those who did the monosaccharides, we looked at the disaccharides like sucrose and the structure of it. We looked at the way the glucose molecules would bond to form more complex molecules, the disaccharides. You have also a group called the oligosaccharides, which would be those with the few monomers constituting them. Then you have the polysaccharides, which are far more complex, poly meaning many. Polysaccharides like the starch, cellulose, and of course, glycogen. We also looked at the way the complex carbohydrates combine using the glycosidic bonds, 1,4 glycosidic bonds and the 1,6 glycosidic bonds, conferring certain special functions, certain properties that will make them suited. In the case of glucose and in the case of starch and glycogen for energy storage, whereas for cellulose it's really for the strengthening properties that would be required in plant cells. All right, so let's have a look at the questions I have for you. It's quiz time. Which of the following combinations of statements is true of polysaccharides in living organisms? So the headings are to provide energy, to form storage compounds, or to form supporting structures. And we have here 5 options, A, B, C, D, and E. A says no in terms of providing energy. Is that correct? I don't think so. We have starch providing energy. Do they form storage compounds? Sure they do. Glycogen and starch, they form storage compounds. And forming supporting structures? Of course, yes, that's correct. Cellulose. But the other 2 are incorrect, and so A would be wrong. So let's look at B. It says no to providing energy, no to forming storage compounds, and no to forming supporting structures, and that is incorrect. If you look through C, yes, providing energy, but it also forms storage compounds. There's a no there, so that could not be correct. And forming supporting structures, no as well. Therefore, C would be incorrect. D says yes to providing energy, yes to forming storage compounds, but no to forming supporting structures. Cellulose does that, and therefore D is incorrect, and the correct answer would be E, because they perform all of those functions, providing energy, forming storage compounds, and forming supporting structures. So you see, as you go through, you have to assess each of the options and make sure that you don't guess, and you use the information that you have at your fingertips to answer the questions correctly. Number 2, polysaccharides are synthesized in plants by the process of A, condensation, B, glycolysis, C, hydrolysis, D, oxidation, and E, reduction. Now, remember we said that polysaccharides are formed from their constituent monosaccharides, and when this happens, water is given off. It's referred to as a condensation reaction. Therefore, your answer is going to be A. Number 3, most polysaccharides are composed of chains of condensed, is it cellulose units, hexose units, C, pentose units, D, sucrose units, or E, triose units. So, I'm sorry. And so the answer has to be B, hexose units, because glucose, which is the predominant monosaccharide, is a hexose molecule. So B, hexose units. Benedict's test was performed on 20 cm³ sample of 4 fruit syrups. A second 20 cm³ sample of each was then hydrolyzed and tested with Benedict solution. The table shows the masses of precipitate formed. Now, this is going to take a little doing. You have to evaluate the information given. It is asking you to state which syrup contains the greatest mass of non-reducing sugar. Now, the mass of precipitate before hydrolysis per milligram in the first column, and the total mass of precipitate after hydrolysis per milligram. A says 25 and 55. B says 50 and 70. C, 55, 55. And D, 75, 85. Now, bear in mind that in the test for reducing and non-reducing sugars, we use the Benedict solution. And the fact is that you have to hydrolyze the sucrose, or non-reducing sugar, in this case it would be sucrose, would hydrolyze it using dilute hydrochloric acid. So the mass of precipitate before hydrolysis would be far less than that after hydrolysis. And in this case, B, C, and D seem to have a large mass of precipitate, and therefore, before hydrolysis, and therefore those could not be the correct answer. The correct answer, therefore, is A, where the difference is about 30, significantly more mass of precipitate after hydrolysis than before. So this one requires a little more a higher order operation, but don't be daunted. I know sometimes when you see figures, you feel that you're going to skip that one. Don't you do that. Sometimes they are the simplest questions on the paper. I'm going to leave number 5 for you to take a snapshot of, if possible, and I'm going to ask you to do that for your homework. That one takes a little thought and a little getting used to. It says 5 disaccharides were each hydrolyzed with dilute acid. Of course, it would be hydrochloric acid. And the purified products were separated by one-dimensional chromatography. Now, remember, chromatography you would have done at CSEC level, where you would separate the dyes in ink using filter paper. I'm not sure if you remember all of that, but that's important. And so you have the spots moving at different, the ink moving at different speeds through the filter paper, and thus causing the dyes that constitute the ink to separate out. A similar fashion here we have the chromatogram shown in the diagram below. And this is for sucrose, is number 1. The questions are, if spot 1 represents the products obtained from the hydrolysis of sucrose, which of the following indicates the results obtained from hydrolysis of lactose and maltose? So you're going to, those are the options there, lactose, maltose, and you're going to look at this diagram and try to analyze it, the positions of the spots, and to see which ones would be lactose and maltose, and then you make your selection there. That is for homework. I hope you have captured it. I'm going to allow you a little time to just do so, and we could probably show it afterwards. Now, the diagram shows a carbohydrate. What is the name of the bond which links the 2 units? And we have done that all morning. That's the link here. That's the bond. What is the name of the bond which links the 2 units? A, glycosidic bond. B, hydrogenic bond. C, oxygen bond. D, peptide bond. E, saccharide bond. And of course, we know it's the glycosidic bond. And this one, I'm going to ask you to take a snapshot of that. You're going to be doing that for your homework as well. Notice I'm giving you ones that require a little thought to do at home. Moving right along to the last one, I think this is, which conclusion is consistent with the results? And that you're going to take. Those are the questions for the previous slide. Of course, success is a must. Grade 1 straight A profile. That's all the time we have for today. So I encourage you to send any question you may have to Television Jamaica's Facebook page at Television Jamaica, or to Instagram at television_Jamaica, or simply use the hashtag TVJClassTime. For a repeat of all 3 sessions, you tune in later today on JNN at 4 p.m., or you can subscribe to onespotmedia.com to catch up on all you have missed. You make sure to join us again tomorrow for more CSEC and CAPE classes. Until then, my children, stay safe. Bless you.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
It's here. Interactive classes for all ages on the School Time channel on onespotmedia.com. With a combination of live Zoom classes and recorded class time, schools not out lessons, and numerous educational content, we've created a comprehensive 24-hour channel dedicated exclusively to educating our nation's youth, early childhood through to primary.